Hey folks, Keith here, Chicken Thigh Fishing. Welcome aboard to our Getting It Done video series. Today we are going to disassemble, clean, lubricate, and reassemble a custom black reel from Lou's Fishing. Before we get started, just a couple of tips that I always provide on my reel cleaning videos. And the first one is that I recommend working on a movable surface. Now the reason you want to do that is because naturally, when you disassemble a fishing reel, there's going to be a lot of small parts. You don't want to leave those out in the open on a kitchen table or something like that in case you get called away or you have to go do something during your project. If you have your parts on a movable surface, you can pick it up, put it on top of the fridge or somewhere out of harm's way where pets and kids can't get to it, and you just take it down and resume your project whenever you get back. If you haven't done this before, it's going to take you a little over an hour to do it at least. So, always a good idea to work on a movable working surface. Next thing I recommend is having your phone available so you can take a few photographs along the way. Taking photographs of the process helps you with the orientation and the position of all the different parts, and you can refer to those photographs when you take them. And as we're disassembling the reel, I will point some key places out to you where you might want to take a photograph. And my last tip is if you have a manual for your reel, have that handy because that will have a schematic blow up of the components of your reel, and that comes in very handy when you need to look at the parts and learn where they go and things like that. If you didn't get one with your reel, all you got to do is go to the manufacturer's website and you can download and print a schematic of the components of your reel. Very helpful. So the first step we're going to do to disassemble the reel is to remove the palm side plate. You will hear me refer to the palm side of the reel, which is the side that goes in your palm, and the handle side of the reel. So the first thing we're going to remove is the palm side plate. And on the custom black reel, that is secured by a spring-loaded pin, and you just got to put a fingernail on that and release the spring tension, and that allows you to rotate it, and you can remove the palm side plate and the spool. Once you have that palm side plate and spool removed, we can move over to the handle side, and that's where we're going to remove the handle assembly, the star drag, and then the handle side plate. So beginning with the handle assembly, we're going to first remove the handle nut retaining screw. Then after the screw is the handle nut retainer itself. And usually gravity will work for you there and it will just pop off. If it doesn't, if it sticks to that because of oil or dirt or grime or anything, you can just use a little tool of any sort and pop it off and it'll come off easily. So now that we have the retainer off, we're going to remove the handle nut. In order to remove the handle nut, you're going to need a 10mm wrench, which fits most bait casting reels, or a small adjustable or whatever wrench you have. But one important point of note regarding removing the handle nut. If you are a lefty like me, and if your handle is on the left-hand side of the reel, it's not right tight, left loose. It's opposite. If your handle's on the right, no problem. But if your handle is on the left, it's reversed. The reason you want to be aware of that is because if you cinch that down and you turn it the wrong way and put force onto it, that nut is easy to strip, so you want to be sure you turn it the correct way. So instead of left to loose, we're going to turn this right to loose because it's a left-handed reel. So I'm just going to crack it. And after I crack it, I can remove it the rest of the way by hand. Once the handle nut is removed, we can remove the handle itself. And you'll see on the handle here, beneath it, there will be a washer. If when you remove the handle, that washer is not on the main gear shaft. That's because it's stuck to the back side of the handle, which happens more often than not when you disassemble a reel. So if you don't see that washer right there on the main gear shaft, that's because it's stuck here and you just have to take it off the handle. Now we will remove that handle washer and place that aside. And the next thing we can do is remove the star drag. And again, it's going to be right to loosen it. And removing that star drag is a simple matter of unscrewing it. Now underneath the star drag, we are going to come to a series of washers. First washer is a castle type washer. Second washer is a flat washer. And the third washer is a flat washer. Now one thing you want to be cognizant of is those two flat washers have a curve in them. One is curved this way, one is curved this way. So when you remove those washers, you want to keep them in the same orientation. So you put them back on the main gear shaft correctly when we reassemble. So when you remove them, when you clean them, and then when you replace them, you want to make sure you keep them in the same orientation so the curves are going the correct way. Next is going to be a sleeve washer, which goes on top of the sleeve down here. And after that, we will lift up the sleeve. And now the sleeve, you want to be cognizant of this. At first glance, both ends of the sleeve appear to be identical. They are not. One end is circular. The other end has two straight sides, kind of in the shape of an oblong rectangle. Those two straight sides, the end with those two sides goes up. The circular end goes down when it comes time for reassembling. You want to remember that when you're cleaning it, when you're handling it, so you put it on the correct way. If you put that on the incorrect way, your reel is not going to work properly, and you'll know that when you reassemble it, and then you'll have to disassemble it down to that point to flip that sleeve over. Now we're going to remove the handle side plate. And unlike the palm side plate, which was held in by that spring tension rod here, the handle side plate is held on by screws. And on the custom black reel, it's going to have 1, 2, 3 screws on the outside of the handle side plate, and it's going to have an additional screw on the inside of the handle side plate. So I'll go ahead and remove the exterior screws first. And when I remove them, I'm going to lay them down on my tray in the same pattern that they come out of the reel, so that when we reassemble, we put the right screws back in the right holes. Because sometimes the screws on a bait casting reel have different sizes, diameters, and lengths to them. Now on the inside screw, that screw doesn't only hold the body of the reel to the handle side plate, but it also secures in place the lubrication port door. So you want to be cognizant of that when you remove that interior screw, because when you remove that, it's going to loosen that port door. And now once you remove that screw, you're going to want to be sure to remove that port door, because if you don't, you're not going to be able to remove the handle side plate. So now that we have the screws removed, we will be able to carefully lift off the handle side plate. And you want to take note that there is a spring and an E-clip that holds this spring-loaded rod in place that secures the palm side plate. It's really no need to remove that. You can if you want to clean it, but you can sufficiently clean it with it in place. So we will lay the handle side plate down, And you'll see that I laid the screws out in the pattern that they go back in the holes, so we put the correct ones. And then of course the one on the opposite side is the screw for the lubrication port door. Now once I have that handle side plate removed, I'm going to grab a screwdriver or anything I have handy to kind of prop up the reel, because sometimes your reel is going to have a tendency to want to fall over, and when you're new at this especially, you don't want any parts to come off that you may not know where they came from if it tips over. So I like to use just a screwdriver or something to prop that up. Now also, here's the first place where I would recommend taking a photograph. Take a photograph of the interior components here so you can see the proper orientation of them. That way when it comes time to disassembly, if you get confused or anything, which you really shouldn't because this is a simple process, but naturally when you do something for the first time, it can be a little intimidating for you. Take a photograph, you'll be able to refer to that when we reassemble. So now the first thing we are going to remove is the pinion gear and the yoke. The first thing on the pinion gear and the yoke to be removed are the two yoke springs, and those simply go on posts that the yoke sits on. And then once we do that, we can grab hold of the pinion gear and pull up on that, and both the pinion gear and the yoke will come out. If it doesn't come out readily, you can take the main gear here and kind of tilt it to the side so it disengages with the pinion gear, and you can remove the pinion gear and the yoke. You can see how dirty those components are. Now you want to note the pinion gear has a wider side and a thinner side, and for the purposes of reassembly you want to remember that that wider side goes down and the thinner side goes up. So we have the pinion gear and we have the yoke. The next thing we're going to disassemble is the drag washer and main gear assembly. So what I'm going to do here is simply lift that assembly off by grabbing hold of the main gear, and when I do, I'm going to put my finger underneath it and hold it all together like a sandwich. The reason for that is there are going to be several parts on top of the main gear as well as underneath the main gear that are going to be stuck to the bottom. More often than not, those are stuck to the bottom. If not, you will see them at the base of the main gear shaft, but if you don't see them at the base of the main gear shaft, they will be stuck here. They may be at the base of the gear shaft, but more often than not, they are going to be stuck to the bottom of your main gear. So I'm going to slide those components out from underneath that are stuck to it, starting with the ratchet. And there'll be a washer there. And then from the top of the gear, we will remove the drag washers. When you remove the drag washers, you want to make sure that there aren't any stuck to each other, so you know you have the exact number of components that you need. And typically that's going to go from metal to carbon fiber to metal. They alternate. So I'm simply going to lay all those components out in the order that they go. And one very important thing you want to take note of here is the ratchet. You will notice on the ratchet that the teeth are facing to the left. You want to be cognizant of that because it must be replaced with the teeth going to the left. It is possible to put it on in the incorrect way with the teeth going to the right. If you do, your reel will not work properly. So you want to make sure that when you remove it, when you handle it, and when you reassemble it, those teeth are going to the left. And the reason is because those teeth have to engage with the kick lever. When I depress the thumb release lever here, you will see how the teeth engage with that. So by moving it back, you can see that if you put it on the incorrect way, with the teeth facing the wrong way, then the ratchet can't engage with the kick lever. And you will know that as soon as you put it together and go to operate it, because the thumb release won't work properly. And I've done that before, believe me when I tell you. If you do that, you have to disassemble it all the way down to this point, simply to turn the ratchet over and put it on the correct way. So be aware that those teeth have to face to the left. So the next thing we're going to remove is the main gear shaft and the bearing plate, which is held in by 2 screws. But there's one thing on this particular reel that you want to be cognizant of, and that is that it has this handy dandy hook keeper on it. It's a nice feature of this reel, and I actually use it. Luz has it on a couple different reels, and it's just a hook keeper that's on the reel instead of your rod. So it comes in very handy if you happen to have a rod that doesn't have a hook keeper on it, or if you don't like the location of the hook keeper on your rod, you can use this. The thing is with this hook keeper is it's spring loaded. You will see that there is a spring right here, and it's attached, and that's what operates that hook keeper. The spring is attached to the hook keeper on one end, but it's also attached to the bearing plate on the other end. So if you remove these 2 screws and pick up the bearing plate, that spring is going to come out. So you want to understand what the orientation of that spring is, and it's kind of small, so you want to pay attention to it. It's not a big deal, but if you don't know it's there, or if you pick it up unknowingly, you may lose that spring. So I'll go ahead and remove the 2 screws on that bearing plate. Okay, so now you will see when I lift up this main gear shaft and the bearing plate, the spring comes with it. There's a hole in the bearing plate that one end of the spring goes in, and I'll just take a minute to explain the orientation to you. One end of the spring has a 90-degree angle, and that 90-degree angle goes into this very tiny hole right there, and that's what gives spring tension to the hook keeper. The other end of the spring has a looped end, and that looped end is what goes into this hole on the bearing plate. So as long as you're aware of that orientation, again, it's not a big deal, you just have to be aware of it. And it's small, so you don't want to lose it. So I'm going to put that spring right over here. And now with the main gear shaft and the bearing plate, you're going to see that there is a bearing underneath it, and it's held in place by an E-clip. And then you have the lower gear on the main gear shaft. You don't need to take this apart any further, although you can, and remove each individual component to clean it. It's not necessary, and I don't like to take reels apart more than I have to in order to achieve a satisfactory cleaning, so I usually leave the main gear shaft and the bearing plate as one unit together and clean it that way, and I've never had a problem doing that. So now that we have the handle side components removed, we can focus our attention on the next things that we are going to disassemble, namely the level wind guide and the worm drive assembly. Now the worm drive assembly and the level wind guide are behind this hood here, and most reels, if not all reels, have this hood. It's a type of just a fascia that goes in front, and so that has to be removed in order to be able to access those. So the first thing we're going to do is remove that hood, which is secured on this reel by a screw on the palm side of the reel. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that screw. So once that screw is removed, there is a pillar that goes through each end of it. And what you're going to want to do is poke that pillar through, and you're going to poke it from the handle side of the reel and remove it from the palm side of the reel. We're going to get back to that pillar in a second. But now you can remove the hood. So now with this pillar, it only goes in one way, and you saw that we removed it from the palm side of the reel. So when it comes time for reassembly, it's going to go back in the palm side of the reel. And what the pillar does is it goes through a hole in the level wind guide, and that's what keeps it stationary and doesn't allow it to rock back and forth. On that pillar, it has one end that has a nub that's a smaller diameter than the rest of the pillar, and so there are 2 different size holes on the housing. one side will accommodate the full width of the wider part, and then it goes through the level wind guide, and the hole on the corresponding side only accommodates the nub. So if you go to put that in on the wrong side of the reel when it comes time for reassembly, you'll see that you cannot fit it in. So we're going to lay that down in the proper orientation that we're going to put it back in. And now that we have that hood and the pillar removed, we can access the level wind guide. And you'll see that the level wind guide can now tip forward because that pillar is removed from it, but it won't move laterally, and that's because it's engaged with the worm drive. And so what we're going to do to disengage it is to remove the cap on the level wind guide. Now typically you can just unscrew that by hand. If it's a little too tight, it has a slot for a slotted screwdriver. And so now I am going to take the cap off, and when you take the cap off, there will be a spacer in there, and the spacer will either be stuck to the top of the pawl here, or it will stick inside the cap. So just in case it's not right here when you take that off, it's probably because it's stuck inside there from oil and dirt. So we'll remove that tiny little spacer. And so the next thing we're going to remove is called the pawl. It's a little piece of metal that drops in this hole in the level wind guide, and it has two ears on it that engage with the grooves in the worm drive. And so all you got to do to remove that is to tap it out and let gravity work. And that is the pawl. And so now that the pawl is removed, you will see that the level wind guide is no longer engaged with the worm drive, so it can move freely. So now the next thing we're going to do is remove the worm drive and the worm drive tube. This is another good place to take a photograph because you want to be familiar with the components that secure it on the palm side as well as the components that secure it on the handle side. The first thing we're going to do is go to the palm side of the reel because there's an E-clip on the end of this worm drive that holds it all together. So the first thing we have to do is remove that E-clip so we can disassemble the rest of it. And so what we're going to do there is just take a little small screwdriver or other implement, and the E-clip will have little notches in it that you can kind of fit that into, and then we're just going to pop it off. You want to make sure you cover this with your hand when you do that, because when you remove an E-clip, it comes off with some force. If you don't cover it with your hand, there's a good chance that could go flying across the room, and if it does, good luck finding it. So we'll put it in position here to pop it off. I will cover it with my hand. I will pop the E-clip off, and typically it will bounce off your hand and fall right into the housing of the reel. And there it is right there. Underneath the E-clip is going to be a spacer, and we'll take that and put that right with the E-clip. And then we have a second spacer. And then we have a plastic bushing. And that bushing will just pop out. And you'll notice on the bushing that one side of it has this kind of rectangular little nub on it. And so you want to be aware of the way that seats in there. And there's really only one way because there's a notch carved out for that nub. So we'll put the bushing. So here we have the palm side of the worm drive. The E-clip, the spacer, and the bushing. And so now we can move over to the handle side, but before we do, since this is now released, we can pull it out and we can remove the level wind guide. So now on the level wind guide, you'll see it has a large hole to accommodate the worm drive tube. It has the smaller hole to accommodate the pillar, and on the front face of it, it has the lower hole in which goes the pawl and the spacer and then the cap, and the upper hole is your line guide, and that's where your line goes onto and leaves your reel. So now we're going to take the handle side components of the worm drive, and so now that it's loose, we can back this gear off a little bit, and you'll see that there's a very small pin in there, and that'll either fall out by gravity, or you can pull it out with your hand, or if you have a difficult time because it's so small, you can just grab a pair of tweezers. I'm just going to knock it through and let it drop to the ground, to the sheet rather, and you can see how small that pin is. Now that pin holds the worm gear onto the worm drive. So we're going to remove the worm gear, and underneath the worm gear is going to be a bearing, which will either come out easily or not, and you may have to kind of pop it out in order to oil that and clean it. And I'm going to remove the worm drive from the worm drive tube, and then go ahead and grab that bearing out of there. So now I have the worm drive and the worm drive tube. Now a couple important things about these components. When it comes time for reassembly, the worm drive tube only goes in one way, and that's because one end of it is lipped. And it is lipped because it forms a cup, and the cup is where the bearing sits. And so you know that the bearing and the gear sit on the cup or the lipped side, and of course the gear is going to be on the gear side or the handle side of your reel. So you're always going to want to make sure that that lipped end of the worm drive tube is on the handle side when it comes time for reassembly. You can put this in the other way, it will fit, but you will soon realize that you can't finish the assembly. So we're going to take that out and put it in the orientation that it's going to go back in, with the lipped end on the handle side of the reel. And then we're going to have the worm drive itself. Now the worm drive itself can only go in one way. The easiest way to remember which way it is, other than the fact that it won't go in the other way, is that there is a hole on one end of the worm drive which accommodates the pin that holds the worm gear in place. So we have the hood, we have the pillar, the worm drive tube, and the worm drive. Then we have the components that secure it all together on the palm side of the reel, and the components that secure it on the handle side of the reel. And that, my friends, is your disassembly. We're not going to disassemble this reel any further, and there's no need to. You certainly can, and you can get about twice as many components as you see here on my tray. There are more components in the housing, in the handle side plate, in the palm side plate, in the spool, and even in the handle knobs. So there are plenty of other parts. It's not necessary to break it down any further unless you want to. The parts do get smaller as you go. It's not necessary to achieve a good solid cleaning and get your reel performing like new again. So now what I'm going to do is clean the parts individually. Now if you ask 100 people what they use to clean reel parts, you probably get 100 different answers. There's 100 different products out there. You can use whatever you want to clean your reel parts. I simply use Clorox or Lysol wipes, any type of cleaning wipes. Very simple, very cheap. They do the job and they don't harm any of the parts. They get all the dirt and grime off. They've always worked for me. So there's no real right or wrong for that. That's what I do. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and methodically clean the parts. I'm going to pick each one up and clean it, but I'm going to make sure I put it back in the same place and in the same orientation that I left it in. Now's another good time you may want to take a photograph, so you can see all the parts and where they are at. In the event that you are to get up or leave, or you bump your tray or move it, or worse yet, spill it on the ground for some reason, you'll still be able to gather your parts and put them back in the same place. So that's a good time to take a picture, is when everything's disassembled and laid out on your work area. So now I'm going to go ahead and clean the parts. Well, I just made a mistake that you can learn from. When I picked up the second curved washer and went to clean it, it had a second washer underneath it, and it was stuck to it. I forgot that washer was there. So, when it comes time for reassembly, we have an extra washer there, And remember earlier when I said on disassembly, you always want to feel on the underside of parts, especially washers, when you remove them, to see if there's another piece there. Because if you drop that and then all of a sudden you see it somewhere and you're just like, where did that come from? You may not know where it came from. You have to refer to your blow-up photo of your components to see where it goes. But I just made that mistake when I disassembled, and I didn't feel that extra washer underneath there. So that happens no matter how many times you do this. Something to be aware of. Okay, so we've cleaned all the parts, and you can see from my cleaning rags that we got a little bit of dirt and grease and oil out of there. And it wasn't too dirty, but it certainly did need a cleaning. And so I'm satisfied that we cleaned everything well. And so now we'll move right back into our reassembly. So basically we're going to reassemble in the reverse order of how we disassemble for the most part. So I'm going to take my reel housing and I'm going to have it facing towards me, with the front towards me. The first thing we're going to do is take our worm drive tube, and remember that only goes in one way. The lipped end has to be on the handle side. So we're going to go ahead and insert that and put it about halfway through, and then we're going to go ahead and slide the level wind guide onto it. And now when you put the worm drive tube through, it's just going to sit into the corresponding hole on the other side, and you can kind of feel that and hear that click into place. And usually when you're reassembling these components, that will pop out from time to time when you're turning the reel over. It's no big deal. You just kind of slide it back in with your finger. So now that we have the level wind guide on the worm drive tube, we can begin to insert and reassemble the worm drive assembly. Now remember, this is going to go in from the palm side towards the handle side, and the end of the worm drive with the hole for the pin is going to go towards the handle side. And so now that we have that in, we can replace the handle side components, beginning with the bearing that goes into the cup that the lip on the worm drive tube forms. And then we're going to hit that bearing with a drop of oil before we replace the worm gear. Now the worm gear has grooves on the top of it in the shape of a cross, and those grooves are for that pin to sit in. So you want to make sure those grooves are facing out or up when you put it on, because the other side doesn't have the grooves, and that's what the pin has to sit in. So we're going to put the worm drive gear on, and we're going to leave enough clearance so we can see that little hole there, and then we're going to go ahead and reinsert the pin. And so now once you get that pin in there, you're just going to kind of manipulate that down by turning the worm gear, the worm drive, and getting that pin to seat into the grooves on that worm gear. And so you just got to kind of turn that around a little bit until it fits into one of the cross patterns of the grooves. And then once you have it flush, that's in position. So now you're going to want to put your finger on that, because if you tip this over and you don't have your finger on it, of course, the pin and the gear are going to fall off. So we'll go ahead and flip the reel over so we can go to the palm side of the worm drive. And that's where we will replace the bushing. And that's with that rectangular little nub in the correct location, and it sits right down in the grooves there. And then we're going to replace the spacers, and then the E-clip. Now on the E-clip, you're just going to want to get that into place so you can get it ready to pop onto the end of that worm drive. So as you can see, I've got it, the ends just kind of poking on there. What I'm going to do is take a small slotted screwdriver and I'm going to pop that on. But what I'm going to do is make sure that I cover it with my hand, just like when we disassembled, because when I put pressure on that, if I go ahead and pop it on and I miss or it glances off the side of that worm drive, it could go flying across the room. So I'll get it into position, I will cover it with my hand, and so now we have the worm drive assembly secured back in place. And we can turn our attention to the level wind guide. And so on the level wind guide, you'll recall that the pawl goes into the hole and it has 2 ears on the end, and those ears go down and they drop into the grooves on the worm drive itself. And so you're simply going to drop that pawl into the hole, and usually it's going to be sticking up above the edge, above the lip of that hole. All you're going to do is turn the worm gear, and the ears on that pawl will find the grooves in the worm gear and it will fall into place. And so when it's flush or lower than that level, you know it's where it's supposed to be. And you can replace the spacer and then the cap. Now once we have the level wind guide in place, we can replace the pillar. And remember, the nubbed end goes toward the handle side of the reel. And now there's going to be a couple holes here, so you want to make sure you get the right one. And it's the front hole. And then it goes through the level wind guide and into the corresponding hole on the handle side of the reel. And now that we have the pillar in place, we can replace the hood. And when the hood is in place, it will also keep the pillar in place. And you recall that the hood has this one very small screw. And we will replace that. You don't want to over tighten that because that hood is made out of thin plastic and you can certainly crack it or break it. So now we have the worm drive assembly reassembled, the level wind guide and the hood, the palm side components and the handle side components, so our whole front is reassembled. And so now what we are going to do is move to the handle side components that we disassembled previously. So the first thing we're going to do is replace the main gear shaft and that bearing plate assembly. First we're going to hit that bearing with a drop of real oil. Now this is the part that's going to be a little tedious because you have to replace that spring that attaches to the bearing plate and attaches to that hook keeper. So the most important part is that 90-degree bend is the part that goes in very small hole. You're going to want to stick the 90-degree angle of the spring into the hole, and that's going to leave the looped end for you to hook on to the bearing plate through that hole that it goes in. And once you have that main gear down there, as long as it's meshed with the worm gear, you know it's in the correct position. And you just double check that you have spring tension on that hook keeper, and you're good to go. So now, making sure those two holes are in the correct place, we will replace the screws. And just check that the spring is in the proper place for that hook keeper to operate, and you're good to go. So now that we have the main gear shaft in place, we can replace the pinion gear and the yoke. Now remember that the pinion gear has the wider side and the thinner side, and the wider side goes down into the hole, and the middle of it engages with the yoke, like so. So we're just going to drop the yoke onto the yoke posts while holding the pinion gear in place, and that should seat right down in there. And you can see that there is a length of post sticking up through the yoke here, and that is to allow you to replace the springs. Now if you put that yoke on and there's not enough posts sticking up to accommodate those springs, it's because you put the yoke on upside down, and all you have to do is flip it over. So I'm going to replace those springs, which is important because those springs seem to be something you can forget to put on. On many occasions, cleaning reels, I have put the whole reel, reassembled it, and then saw 2 springs sitting in the corner of my cookie sheet, and then I have to disassemble all the way down to get here just to put the springs on the posts. So remember the springs. Next, we are going to reassemble the drag washer and main gear assembly, beginning with the ratchet. And we're going to remember to put the ratchet with the teeth facing the correct way. And the ratchet has an oblong rectangular shape in the middle, which is going to seat on the bottom of the main gear shaft. So you want to make sure that that seats all the way down. And you can just kind of click that in place, like so. And those teeth are facing the proper way to engage with the kick lever. Next is a carbon washer. And then the main gear. Now when you put the main gear on, it may go straight down, but you may have to tip back the pinion gear a little bit to allow the teeth to get past it and to engage with it. And then you can see here the teeth on the main gear are engaged with the teeth on the pinion gear. Now we'll replace the drag washers in the reverse order in which we disassembled them. Now they do make grease for these carbon washers. I've never used it, but I suppose it can't hurt. Now we have the drag washer and the main gear assembly and the pinion gear and yoke in place. We can replace the sleeve. Now remember, the sleeve has a circular end and an end that has 2 straight sides in that oblong rectangular shape. That side goes up, the circular side goes down. And then we will replace the first washer, the sleeve washer, and then the second washer. So once we have the sleeve and the washers on, we can replace the handle side plate. Before we replace it, we're going to hit the bearing with a drop of oil along with the clutch. There's a bearing in there for the spool tensioner. The last thing we're going to do before we install that handle side plate is to apply grease to the main gear. And so I will just put a small layer of grease, a thin layer of grease, along the outer edge of that gear. You don't have to put a lot. And then we are ready for the handle side plate. And now remember, we have the spring rod that holds on the palm side plate, and that has to go through the remaining hole on the body of the reel. So you're just going to want to line that up and then drop the handle side plate in place. Now one thing to point out here is that if you tip this over, those washers that are on top of the sleeve are going to fall off, so you just want to be aware of that. So now that I have the handle side plate on, I'm going to replace the screws in the pattern that they came out in. This screw goes here, this screw goes here, and this screw goes here, and this is the back one for that lubrication port door. So I'll go ahead and replace those screws. Okay, so we have the exterior screws replaced, as well as the interior screw that holds in the lubrication port door. And now we can replace the curved washers, which we're going to replace in the same orientation that we removed them, so they are in the correct position. Then the star drag washer. And then the star drag. Getting the star drag on can take a minute because that first thread can be a little tricky because of the shape of the inside of the star drag. And then once you get it on, it should spin freely. That's important because if you feel any resistance when you spin that star drag on, you want to stop what you're doing and start over, because if there's any resistance, it means you've cross-threaded it and it's easy to strip the inside of that. So as long as it's spinning freely, you know it's on correctly. And then once it stops, if you continue to spin it, it's going to eventually want to move that level wind guide. So if you just hold that still with your finger, you're able to tighten that down the rest of the way, allowing you to put on the handle washer and then the handle. Once the handle is on, we put on the handle nut. Again, left to tighten it because it's a left-handed reel. And again, you want to be careful for that first thread. It should go on nice and easily. If you meet any resistance, stop and straighten it out so you can get it on correctly, because it does have that rectangular shape on the main gear shaft, which makes it a little difficult sometimes to get that first thread on. Okay, there we go. So I'm just going to hand tighten that, and next we're going to replace the handle nut retainer. And what you want to do with that handle nut retainer is try to line the hole up on the retainer with the hole on the handle. But 9 times out of 10, it's not going to be lined up, and so you just have to get it as close as you can, and then you can tweak it with the wrench to get it lined up perfectly, so it's lined up well enough to put the handle nut retaining screw in. Okay, now we can move over to the palm side of the reel and insert the spool. First, we're going to hit the spool bearing with some oil. Insert that. And our last component will be the palm side plate, which also has a bearing you're going to want to oil. And that bearing goes to the external magnetic brake dial. Then you can just go ahead and snap that palm side plate into place. And there you have it, folks. One reassembled bait casting reel. Want to make sure it works fine, smooth, quiet, just like new. Now, of course, you'll have to adjust your drag as well as your spool tensioner if you move that during the process, but you want to make sure everything is smooth like so. You want to press your thumb release to make sure that that ratchet is on correctly and the teeth are facing the correct way. And if you depress it and you can close it like that, you know it's on correctly. So I hope this video was a help to you if you own a Lew's custom black bait casting reel. One of my favorite reels. I love it. Take good care of it. It will take good care of you. If you like the video, hit that like button and hit the subscribe button. We really appreciate it, and it helps our channel grow. And if you have another reel that you'd like to see me do a video on, let me know in the comments section. And if I have that reel or I have access to it, I'll go ahead and do a video on it. Hey, we'll see you next time, folks. Enjoy. Stay fishing, my friends.